The night was quiet as he drove through the empty streets toward home, his mind drifting over the small joys waiting for him: the warmth of Zira's embrace, the comforting presence of their dog, Rex, and the familiar feel of their shared space. The day's exhaustion was heavy on him, but it was softened by the thought of returning to those he loved. He imagined the soft light spilling from the windows, the usual sounds of Rex's eager pause at the door, and Zira's serene smile, all waiting for him as they always did. But tonight the atmosphere held something different. He could feel it as he pulled up to the house, an odd silence that stretched out like a heavy fog, making the world feel hushed and strange. As he unlocked the door, he was met with silence. Usually Rex would be there first, his tail wagging excitedly, his soft, joyful bark welcoming him home. But tonight there was no sound, only a strange, cold quiet that seemed to press in from every corner of the house. He stepped inside, calling out softly, but no one responded. His voice seemed swallowed by the stillness, as though the air itself were holding its breath. The unease stirred in his chest, a feeling that something was not quite right. He walked through the dim hallway, guided only by a faint, eerie glow coming from the living room. The light was strange, not the warm, inviting glow of a lamp or even the soft flicker of candlelight. It was pale, with an almost otherworldly hue, casting long shadows that danced and shifted as though they were alive. The edges of his vision blurred, and he felt a prickling sensation rise along his arms, as if he were trespassing in a place he didn't fully recognize. Pushing open the door to the living room, he stopped, stunned by the sight before him. Zira was sitting cross-legged on the floor, facing Rex, who sat rigid and silent. She looked different tonight. Her skin, which normally seemed to hold a soft glow of its own, appeared almost translucent, reflecting the strange, ethereal light. Her eyes were closed, but her expression was intense, her face softened by a quiet concentration that seemed almost reverent. Across from her, Rex was sitting as still as a statue, his eyes locked onto her as if they shared some invisible thread of connection. The air was thick with something he couldn't name, a feeling that hung between them like a fog, both intimate and impenetrable. It wasn't just silence, it was an absence of sound so deep that it felt sacred, as though any noise might shatter something fragile and precious between them. He felt like an intruder, witnessing something he wasn't meant to see, yet he couldn't look away. Zira, he called softly, but his voice barely cut through the air, muffled and swallowed as though he were underwater. She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she took a slow, deep breath and opened her eyes, turning to him with a look that was both familiar and deeply foreign. Her gaze was intense, filled with an emotion he couldn't identify, a strange mixture of sorrow, reverence, and something else, something far beyond his understanding. Her gaze shifted back to Rex, and he found himself following it, feeling a strange sense of apprehension as he looked at their dog. But tonight, Rex didn't seem like the playful companion he knew. There was a depth in the dog's eyes, a stillness and intensity that felt unnerving. Rex's usual warmth, his eager energy, had been replaced by something darker, something that felt almost ancient. The feeling clawed at him, making him shift uncomfortably, and yet he couldn't shake the sense that he was standing on the edge of something immense, something so old that it defied time itself. Zira finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper, as though she feared disturbing the silence. "Can you feel it?" she asked, her gaze locked onto his, holding him in place. He could only nod, unable to find the words to describe what he was feeling. It was as if the very fabric of the room had shifted, like they were standing between worlds, caught in a liminal space where reality and something else intersected. She extended a hand toward Rex, her fingers hovering just inches from his fur, and he watched as the dog responded, lifting his head ever so slightly to meet her touch. Her hand rested on Rex's head, her fingers moving slowly, almost reverently through his fur. Her touch was soft, delicate, as though she feared breaking whatever bond had formed between them. The air grew heavier, filled with a weight he couldn't understand, and he felt an inexplicable pang of jealousy, watching the connection between them. It was more than affection, it was something far deeper, something that felt eternal. He felt as though he were watching two beings communicate without words, sharing a bond that stretched beyond time and space. A flicker of something dark twisted in his chest, an uncomfortable sensation he didn't want to name. "Rex is more than he appears," Zira said finally, her voice filled with a gravity he had never heard before. She looked at him, her expression softened with a mixture of sorrow and understanding. "I didn't realize it until tonight, but there's something ancient within him. Something that I thought I had left behind, far from here, far from this world." He felt a shiver run through him as her words sank in. Ancient. The word felt heavy, weighted with an implication he couldn't quite grasp. He looked at Rex, trying to see the dog he knew, the loyal friend who had been by his side for years. But now, under Zira's touch and the strange light, Rex looked different. He looked almost otherworldly, as if a part of him didn't belong to this world at all. Zira continued, her voice softer now, as if speaking to herself. In my world, we have legends. Stories of souls that travel across lifetimes, meeting and parting, bound by forces we can't always understand. I thought they were only myths, stories we told ourselves to explain the unexplainable. But tonight I felt it. I felt him. Her hand rested on Rex's head, and he could see the faintest tremor in her fingers, as though she were struggling to hold back an emotion too powerful to contain. Her gaze softened as she looked down at Rex, her eyes filled with an almost painful tenderness. It's like I've known him before, she murmured, her voice barely audible. Not as he is now, but as something else in another time. Another place. She looked up at him, her eyes pleading for understanding. This isn't just a dog, not to me. He's a soul I've known, a soul I've loved, in a way that I can't explain. He felt the words sink into him like stones, each one deepening the ache in his chest. A soul she'd known, a soul she'd loved. The implications were overwhelming, and he struggled to make sense of them. His mind raced with questions, with doubts, with a sense of loss he couldn't articulate. But even as he grappled with the revelation, he felt the truth of it. There was something ancient in the way Zira looked at Rex, something that went beyond the love of a pet or a companion. It was a bond that felt primal, raw, a connection that had endured lifetimes. And he was left standing there, on the outside of something he couldn't touch, something that was beyond his reach. For a moment, he felt a surge of jealousy, an irrational anger that flared up like a fire. He was her partner, her chosen one in this life, and yet here she was, gazing at Rex as though he held the answers to a mystery she'd carried for eons. But the anger faded as quickly as it had come, replaced by a strange, hollow acceptance. He realized that whatever bond they shared, it was something sacred, something he could never truly understand or replicate. Zira looked at him, her gaze filled with both apology and resolve. I don't expect you to understand, she said softly, her voice barely a whisper. But this bond, it's older than us. Older than this life. And I don't think it's something I can ignore. He looked at her, feeling the weight of her words settle over him like a shadow. In that moment, he understood that whatever had connected them in this life, Zira and Rex shared something deeper, something he could never touch. It was a love that had transcended lifetimes, a bond that would endure, whether he understood it or not. He sat down beside Zira, his mind still swimming with the strange weight of the atmosphere in the room, the air thick with something he could only describe as reverence. The dim glow from the lamps cast long shadows across her face, accentuating her sharp, delicate features, the subtle iridescence of her skin catching the light and making her seem almost ghostly. He felt as though he was in the presence of something sacred, something ancient. Zira's hand rested gently on Rex's head, her fingers threading through his fur with an almost painful tenderness. The dog sat perfectly still, his dark eyes fixed on her with a focus that went beyond loyalty, beyond even affection. There was something in Rex's gaze that he had never seen before, something deep and knowing, as though Rex were not merely an animal but a being of profound wisdom. It was a look that made him feel inexplicably small, as though he were in the presence of something far greater than himself. Zira turned to him, her eyes soft yet filled with an unspoken gravity. She hesitated, as though searching for the right words, as though knowing that once she began, there would be no turning back. Do you remember the first night we met, she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He nodded, feeling a chill run down his spine. He remembered every detail of that night, the way she had looked at him across the room, her gaze piercing and intense, as though she saw into the very heart of him. He remembered feeling drawn to her, inexplicably, as though some invisible thread connected them, pulling him toward her with a force he could neither explain nor resist. Zira smiled faintly, her eyes growing distant, lost in a memory. When I saw you, I felt a familiarity, a strange sense of recognition. It was like seeing an old friend, or more than a friend, a companion from long ago. But there was something else, she said, her gaze drifting down to Rex. Something older. He frowned, feeling a pang of confusion. He had always assumed that her sense of recognition had been about him, about their connection. But now, as he watched the way she looked at Rex, he felt a strange, twisting sensation in his chest. It was as if he were standing on the edge of something vast and unknowable, something that he was both terrified and desperate to understand. There are things I haven't told you, she continued, her voice so soft he had to strain to hear. Things about my past, about where I come from. In my world, we believe in the continuity of souls, that certain souls travel together across lifetimes, across worlds, bound by a connection that transcends time and space. He felt a shiver ripple through him. Her words seemed to sink into the very marrow of his bones, resonating with something deep and primal, something that he could not name. He had heard stories of reincarnation, of souls traveling together across lifetimes, but he had always dismissed them as fantasies, myths told by those afraid of death. But as he looked at Zira, saw the solemnity in her eyes, he realized that this was not a story. This was her truth, her reality. Rex is one of those souls, she said, her gaze locked onto his with an intensity that made him shudder. He is more than just a dog. He is a soul I have known before, in another time, another place. A soul that has been with me for lifetimes. Her words hit him like a punch to the gut. He felt a wave of disbelief, of jealousy, of confusion, all colliding within him. He looked at Rex, at the dog who had been his loyal companion for years, and yet, in this moment he seemed like a stranger. A stranger who had somehow known Zira in ways he never could, who had shared lifetimes with her, carried memories and secrets that he would never be privy to. Zira continued, her voice filled with a quiet sorrow. In my world, we have legends about souls that are bound together, souls that find each other again and again, across lifetimes, across galaxies. Sometimes they are lovers, sometimes friends, sometimes enemies. But their bond is unbreakable. It is a force that draws them together, no matter where they go. He felt his throat tighten, his hands clenching at his sides. The thought of Zira sharing such a bond with Rex, of all beings, stirred something dark and painful within him. He had always thought that he was the one closest to her, the one who understood her best. But now he felt as though he were standing on the outside, looking in on a world that was not his own, a world that he could never enter. Zira seemed to sense his turmoil, her gaze softening as she reached out, her fingers brushing lightly against his arm. This doesn't change anything between us, she said gently, her voice filled with a quiet desperation. You are my partner, my chosen one in this life. But Rex is part of a past that I cannot ignore. He is a part of me in a way that I cannot explain. He felt the weight of her words press down on him, suffocating, overwhelming. He looked at Rex, at the dog who had been his friend, his confidant, and saw something he had never noticed before. There was an intelligence in Rex's eyes, a depth that felt almost human. And as he looked into those eyes, he felt a strange, terrifying realization settle over him. Rex was not just a dog. He was something more, something ancient and powerful, a soul that had walked with Zira through lifetimes. He felt a surge of jealousy, a bitter resentment that twisted like a knife in his chest. He wanted to shout, to demand answers, to understand why he, a mere man, could never hope to match this bond, this inexplicable connection that defied reason. Zira's hand tightened on his arm, grounding him, her touch filled with an unspoken plea. Please, she whispered, her voice trembling. Try to understand. This bond, it is not a threat to us. It is simply a part of who I am, a part of who Rex is. I cannot change that, and I don't want to. He looked at her, at the sorrow in her eyes, the vulnerability that she rarely showed. And in that moment, he felt his anger begin to fade, replaced by a strange, aching sadness. He realized that this bond, this ancient connection, was something he could never understand, something that he would always be on the outside of. But he also realized that it was not something he could deny her, something he could tear away from her without tearing away a piece of her soul. The silence stretched between them, heavy and profound, filled with all the words they could not say. He felt as though he were standing on the edge of a vast chasm, looking into a depth that he could never fathom. And yet, despite the pain, despite the jealousy, he felt a strange sense of peace settle over him. He looked at Rex, at the dog who had been his friend, his companion, and for the first time he saw him not as a pet, but as something more. He saw the ancient soul within him, the soul that had traveled across lifetimes, across galaxies, to find Zira again. And in that moment he felt a strange kinship with Rex, a sense of respect and acceptance that he had never felt before. Zira reached out, taking his hand in hers, her touch warm and grounding. Thank you, she whispered, her voice filled with gratitude. Thank you for understanding. I know this is difficult, but I promise this bond, it does not change what we have. It only deepens it. He nodded, feeling a tear slip down his cheek, the weight of her words settling over him like a balm. He realized that this bond, this ancient connection, was something he could never fully understand. But he also realized that it was a part of who Zira was, a part of the woman he loved. And as he sat there, holding her hand, he felt a strange sense of peace, a sense of acceptance. He understood now that love was not always something that could be explained, something that could be confined to one lifetime, one relationship. Sometimes, love was something vast and ancient, something that spanned galaxies, something that could not be contained. In that moment, he knew that he would stand by her, that he would support her, even if he could never fully understand. Because he realized that love was not always about understanding. Sometimes it was simply about acceptance, about trusting in something greater than oneself. And as he looked at Zira, at Rex, he felt a sense of unity, a sense of connection that went beyond words, beyond time, beyond anything he had ever known. They sat together in the dim light of the living room, the weight of silence stretching between them like a gossamer thread, fragile yet binding. Zira's gaze was distant, her eyes focused on some unseen horizon beyond the walls of their home, and he could see the strain in her face as she prepared to speak. This wasn't a simple story she was about to tell. He could sense that it was something sacred, something she had never shared before. Where I come from. She began softly, her voice barely louder than a whisper. We speak of souls as travelers. Souls are not bound to one form, one life, or one place. They are free to move through time and space, carrying pieces of each existence with them, like fragments of a song, bits of light. She paused, her fingers lightly tracing patterns in the air, as if weaving the tale out of the very shadows. He listened, captivated, feeling the strange pull of her words, as if they reached into some deep, hidden part of himself that had always longed to understand. He felt a shiver run down his spine, an unexplainable thrill, as though she were lifting a veil on a secret he had sensed but never truly known. I didn't always believe this, she continued, her voice thick with memories. In my youth, I dismissed the tales of soul travelers as just stories, legends. But as I grew older, I realized they were more than that. These were echoes of our history, stories meant to remind us of our true nature. She looked down at Rex, who lay at her feet, his eyes watching her with an intensity that was almost human. There was something ancient in his gaze, something that seemed to understand her every word. Rex was listening, truly listening, as if he, too, remembered. There are certain souls, she said, her hand resting on Rex's head, who are bound together, destined to meet again and again, lifetime after lifetime. These souls are linked in ways that defy logic, bound by forces that neither time nor space can sever. In some lives, they are lovers. In others, they are friends, enemies, siblings, even rivals. But they always find each other. He felt a strange, twisting sensation in his chest, a combination of awe and something else, something darker. The thought of Zira and Rex having known each other in other forms, other lives, filled him with a sense of unease. He had always believed that he was the one who had been chosen by her, that their love was something unique, something born in this life and bound to it. But now, as he listened to her words, he realized that he was part of something far greater than he had ever imagined. Zira's gaze softened as she looked at him, sensing his discomfort. I know this is hard to understand, she murmured, her voice filled with a quiet empathy. Our minds are not always equipped to grasp the vastness of a soul's journey. But I need you to know that this bond I share with Rex, it does not take away from what I feel for you. If anything, it has helped me understand the depths of love, of connection, in ways I never could have otherwise. She took a deep breath, as if steeling herself, and then continued, her eyes focused once more on Rex. One of my earliest memories, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, is of a world bathed in blue light. I remember standing on the shores of an endless sea, looking out at a sky that was not our own. I remember feeling complete, whole, as if I were part of the very fabric of the universe. Her words painted vivid images in his mind, and he could almost see it, the endless ocean under an alien sky, the strange, ethereal glow illuminating the waves. He felt as if he, too, were standing on that shore, as if he were looking out over that boundless expanse, feeling the weight of infinity pressing down on him. There was someone with me, she continued, her eyes distant and filled with longing. A presence, a companion. I cannot remember his face, his form, but I remember the feeling of him. It was a love that went beyond words, beyond time. We did not need to speak to understand each other. We simply were. He looked down at Rex, his mind racing. Could it be? Could this dog, this creature who had been his friend, his companion, be the same soul she had known on that distant shore? The thought was both thrilling and terrifying. He felt his heart pound in his chest, the weight of the realization pressing down on him. Zira continued, her voice growing softer, almost wistful. Over the centuries, we found each other again and again, in different forms, in different worlds. Sometimes he was a warrior, sometimes a healer, sometimes even a creature that roamed the forests. But always his soul was the same. Always, I recognized him. Her words hung in the air, filling the room with an eerie stillness. He felt as though he were standing on the edge of a vast, unfathomable chasm, looking down into a depth he could never truly comprehend. And yet, he could feel the truth of it, like a whisper in his soul, an echo of something ancient and eternal. She looked at him then, her eyes filled with a pleading softness. "I know this is strange, perhaps even frightening, but I need you to understand that this bond is something that transcends this life, this reality. It is a part of who I am, a part of who he is. It is something sacred, something I carry with me, even now." He felt a tear slip down his cheek, the weight of her words sinking into him like stones. The thought of her having shared lifetimes with Rex, of them having known each other in ways he could never understand, filled him with a strange, aching sadness. And yet, he could not deny the beauty of it, the profundity of a bond that could endure beyond time and space. As he looked into Zira's eyes, he felt something shift within him. It was as if he were opening a door to a part of himself he had never known, a part that understood, on some deep, primal level, the truth of her words. He realized that love was not something that could be confined to one life, one form. It was something far greater, something that reached across the universe, binding souls together in ways that defied explanation. Zira reached out, her hand brushing against his cheek, her touch warm and grounding. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice filled with gratitude. "Thank you for listening, for being here. I know this is not easy to understand, but I hope you can see that this bond does not take away from what we have. If anything, it deepens it." He looked down at Rex, at the dog who had been his friend, his companion, and for the first time he saw him not just as a pet, but as something more. He saw the ancient soul within him, the soul that had walked with Zira through lifetimes, across galaxies, bound by a love that could not be broken. And in that moment he felt a sense of peace, a sense of acceptance. He realized that he was part of something far greater than himself, something vast and beautiful, something that reached beyond time and space. And as he looked at Zira, at Rex, he felt a sense of unity, a sense of connection that went beyond words, beyond understanding. They were bound together, the three of them, by forces that defied explanation, forces that transcended this life, this reality. And he knew, in that moment, that he would stand by them, that he would walk with them through whatever came, bound by a love that was as ancient as the stars. In the days that followed Zira's revelation, a quiet tension began to settle between them, as intangible yet as real as the walls of their home. He tried to brush it off, telling himself that nothing had changed. Zira was still the woman he loved, and Rex was still his loyal companion. And yet, every time he looked at them, a subtle ache tightened in his chest, a gnawing feeling that something precious was slipping through his fingers. He found himself studying them more closely, catching glimpses of their quiet, wordless exchanges, moments when Zira would look at Rex with an intensity that felt almost like reverence, or when Rex would press his head into her palm, his gaze soft and knowing. It was an unspoken language, one he couldn't understand, and each time he witnessed it, it felt like another barrier rose between him and Zira. One evening he finally decided to confront her. They were sitting in the living room, the soft glow of the lamps casting long shadows across the walls. Rex lay curled up beside Zira, his head resting on her lap as she absently stroked his fur, her gaze distant and thoughtful. He watched them, feeling the familiar pang of jealousy twist in his gut, and before he could stop himself, the words tumbled out. "Do you love him?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper, his tone harsher than he'd intended. Zira looked up, startled, her eyes widening in surprise. "What are you talking about?" she asked, a hint of hurt flickering across her face. He hesitated, the words sticking in his throat, but he forced himself to continue. "You said that Rex is someone you've known before, a soul you've loved in past lives. I can't pretend that doesn't bother me, Zira. I feel like I'm competing with something I can't even understand." For a moment she was silent, her gaze dropping to Rex, who looked up at her with a quiet, unwavering loyalty. She took a deep breath, her fingers stilling in his fur as she turned back to him. "It's not like that," she said softly, her voice filled with a quiet desperation. "Rex and I, we share a bond, yes, but it's not the same as what I feel for you." He shook his head, frustration bubbling up inside him. "But how can I believe that? You speak of him as if he's something sacred, like he's a part of you in a way that I could never be." The words hung in the air, heavy and bitter, and he saw the hurt in her eyes, the way her face tightened as if she had been slapped. But he couldn't take them back, they were the truth, raw and painful, and he needed her to understand what he was feeling. "I thought," he paused, his voice trembling slightly. "I thought we had something special, something unique. But now I feel like I'm just a small part of your life, like there's this entire world you share with him, a world I can't enter." Zira's gaze softened, her expression filled with sorrow. "You are special to me," she murmured, reaching out to touch his hand, "more than you can ever know." But this connection with Rex, it's a part of who I am. It's something that has followed me through lifetimes, something I cannot ignore. He pulled his hand away, the gesture sharp and defensive. And what am I supposed to do with that, he demanded, his voice tinged with bitterness. Just accept that there's a piece of you I can never touch. A love I can never compete with. Zira flinched, pain flickering across her face. It's not a competition, she whispered, her voice barely audible. It's just a part of me, a part of my soul. I can't explain it, and I don't expect you to understand. But it doesn't change what I feel for you. He looked away, his chest tight, the words swirling in his mind, relentless and unforgiving. How could he be expected to accept this? To share her with a connection so profound, so ancient, that it made his own love feel small, insignificant. It was like trying to hold water in his hands, feeling it slip through his fingers no matter how tightly he tried to grasp it. The silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating, filled with all the things they couldn't say. He could feel her gaze on him, filled with a pleading sadness, but he couldn't bring himself to meet it. The words stuck in his throat, bitter and aching, and he felt as though he were standing on the edge of a chasm, staring into a void he could never cross. Finally, Zira broke the silence, her voice soft and trembling. I never wanted this to hurt you, she whispered. I never wanted you to feel like you weren't enough. You are more than enough. You are my chosen partner in this life. But the bond I share with Rex, it's different. It doesn't diminish what I feel for you. If anything, it has taught me how to love more deeply, more fully. He closed his eyes, feeling a tear slip down his cheek. Her words were beautiful, poetic even, but they did nothing to ease the ache in his chest. He wanted to believe her, wanted to trust in the love they shared, but the thought of that ancient bond, that connection that defied time and space, lingered like a shadow, a constant reminder that he would never truly have all of her. Without another word, he stood up and left the room, his footsteps echoing through the silence. As he walked away, he felt the weight of her gaze on his back, heavy with unspoken words, with sorrow and regret. But he couldn't turn back. Not yet. That night, he lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing with questions, with doubts. He tried to imagine a future with Zira, a life where he could accept this bond she shared with Rex, where he could learn to live with the knowledge that there was a part of her he could never fully understand. But no matter how hard he tried, the doubts remained, gnawing at him like a wound that refused to heal. He felt her climb into bed beside him, felt the warmth of her body as she curled up against him, her hand resting gently on his chest. He could feel the steady rhythm of her breathing, could smell the faint, familiar scent of her hair. But it brought him no comfort. Instead, it only served to remind him of what he could never have, of the love that lay just beyond his reach. As he lay there in the dark, he felt the weight of her sorrow, her regret, pressing down on him, and he realized that this was a wound that might never heal. Their love had been tested, fractured by a truth that was both beautiful and unbearable, and he didn't know if it could survive. The night stretched on, silent and unyielding, filled with the echoes of all the things they could never say. And as he drifted into a restless sleep, he felt the shadow of that ancient bond lingering in the room, a quiet, haunting presence that would always be there, a reminder of a love that defied the bounds of this life. In the darkness, he dreamed of a distant shore, of a boundless blue sky stretching out over an endless sea. He saw Zira standing there, her gaze fixed on the horizon, her hand resting on the head of a figure he could not quite see. And as he watched them, he felt an ache so deep, so raw, that it took his breath away. It was a love that he could never touch, a bond that would always be beyond him, just out of reach. And in that dream, he understood that no matter how much he loved her, no matter how deeply he cared, there would always be a part of her that belonged to someone else, to something older and far beyond his grasp. The tension between them had become a living thing, creeping into every corner of their home, filling the spaces where laughter and quiet moments once lived. Days passed, each one casting a longer shadow on their relationship, and though he wanted to reach for her, to bridge the widening chasm between them, the weight of Zira's bond with Rex felt like an immovable wall between them. One evening, unable to bear the silence any longer, he decided to confront her. They were alone in the living room, the glow of the setting sun casting an amber hue across Zira's face as she sat beside him. He could feel his pulse quicken, his mind racing with everything he wanted to say, but as he opened his mouth, the words stuck in his throat. He looked into her eyes and felt the words wilt. The vulnerability in her gaze was like a reflection of his own. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and strained. Zira, I need to understand, he began, struggling to keep the pain from creeping into his voice. This bond you have with Rex, it's like a part of you I can't reach. I can't keep pretending it doesn't hurt me. I don't know how to be with you when I feel like I'll always be second. Zira's face softened, her lips parting as if to speak, but she closed her mouth, her gaze dropping to her hands. For a long moment she was silent, as though weighing each word she was about to say. You mean more to me than you realize, she said at last, her voice barely above a whisper. But this connection with Rex, it's a part of my soul, a part of who I am. I can't erase it or make it disappear. It doesn't mean I love you any less, but I can't deny it. Her words hung between them, laden with a raw honesty that was both comforting and agonizing. He felt his chest tighten, the weight of her confession pressing down on him, and for a moment he was tempted to turn away, to close himself off from the pain of it. But something kept him there, a desperate need to understand, to find a way through this labyrinth of feelings. Then help me understand, he said, his voice trembling with the plea. Show me what this bond means to you. Show me why it's so important. I want to trust you, Zira, but I need to know that you're truly with me, that this isn't going to take you away from us. Zira looked up at him, her eyes filled with a sorrow so deep it seemed to bleed into the air around them. She reached for his hand, her touch warm and grounding, and held it tightly as though she were holding on to something precious, something fragile. There's a way, she said quietly, her voice hesitant. But it will require a leap of faith from you, a trust beyond words. I can show you what this connection is, but it's not something that can be explained. It's something that must be felt, something that may be unsettling. His heart pounded, a mixture of fear and anticipation clawing at him. He looked into her eyes and saw the vulnerability there, the pleading for him to trust her, to take this leap with her. For a brief moment he hesitated, wondering what he was about to witness, what truths might be revealed. But he realized that this was the moment their relationship had been waiting for, a test not just of his love but of his willingness to trust her completely, even when he couldn't fully understand. With a deep breath he nodded. I'll do it, he said, his voice barely a whisper. Show me. Zira's gaze softened, relief flickering in her eyes, and she gently pulled him down to the floor beside her. Rex sat across from them, his dark eyes calm and knowing, as if he, too, understood the gravity of the moment. Zira placed one hand on Rex's head, the other on his, and closed her eyes. Breathe, she whispered, her voice like a gentle breeze. And let yourself go. Let go of everything you think you know, everything you feel. Just be. He closed his eyes, trying to steady his breath, his pulse pounding in his ears. For a moment he felt nothing, only the familiar darkness behind his eyelids. But slowly a warmth spread through him, radiating from Zira's hand, seeping into his skin, into his bones. It was a warmth that was both comforting and unnerving, like stepping into an ocean whose depth he could not see. Images began to flicker behind his closed eyes, faint and distant at first, but growing sharper with each breath. He saw flashes of landscapes he did not recognize, endless plains under strange, swirling skies, towering mountains that seemed to touch the stars, and cities bathed in ethereal light, all foreign yet hauntingly familiar. He felt as though he were slipping into a different life, a different world, and the sensation was both exhilarating and terrifying. And then he saw her. Zira stood in one of those alien landscapes, her form slightly different, her features sharper, her skin shimmering with a faint, otherworldly glow. She was not the Zira he knew, yet he recognized her with a certainty that defied reason. She looked at him with a gaze filled with love and sorrow, and beside her stood a figure, a creature that radiated strength and loyalty, with eyes that bore the same deep intelligence he had seen in Rex. The realization hit him like a wave. This was Rex, or rather, the soul that was Rex, bound to Zira in a way that went beyond words, beyond comprehension. They shared a love that was ancient, a bond forged across countless lives, through battles and joys, through lifetimes spent together in forms he could not even name. He felt their connection, raw and unbreakable, as if it were a thread woven through the fabric of the universe itself. A part of him recoiled, feeling the sting of jealousy, of inadequacy. How could he ever compete with a bond like this, a love that had withstood the test of time and space? But as he watched them, felt the depth of their connection, something within him softened. He realized that this was not a love that threatened his own, but one that existed alongside it, a love that had shaped Zira into the woman he now held dear. The vision faded, the images dissolving into darkness, and he opened his eyes, his breath coming in shallow gasps. Zira was looking at him, her expression filled with a quiet understanding, as though she knew what he had seen, what he had felt. She didn't speak, didn't try to explain, but simply waited, allowing him to process the truth he had just witnessed. He swallowed, his throat tight with emotion. The jealousy, the fear, the doubt, all of it still lingered, but it was softened by something new, a fragile sense of acceptance. He reached for her hand, squeezing it tightly, and she responded, her fingers entwining with his. I still don't fully understand, he whispered, his voice shaky. But I think I'm beginning to see. This bond you have with Rex, it's something beyond me, something I'll never truly know. But I can see now that it doesn't take you away from me. It's just a part of who you are. Tears glistened in Zira's eyes and she nodded, a faint smile breaking through her sorrow. Thank you, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Thank you for trusting me, for being willing to see. They sat together in silence, their hands clasped, the room filled with a newfound peace. The tension that had once weighed on them felt lighter, as though a veil had been lifted, revealing a deeper truth beneath. He still felt the ache of not fully understanding, the sadness of knowing there was a part of her that would forever remain beyond his reach. But he also felt a profound sense of unity, a bond that was all the stronger for having faced this test, this trial of trust and understanding. As they sat in the dim light, Rex settled beside them, his head resting on their clasped hands, his eyes filled with a quiet, timeless wisdom. And in that moment he felt a tentative, fragile peace settle over him. He knew the road ahead would not be easy, that this bond would continue to challenge him, to test the strength of his love. But he also knew that he was willing to face it, to walk this path beside her, bound by a love that, while young, had proven its resilience. They were together, the three of them, bound by different loves, different lifetimes. And in the stillness he felt a sense of gratitude, a sense of quiet understanding that, somehow, they would find their way forward together. The days that followed were filled with a new, tentative silence, not the heavy, oppressive silence of before, but one that felt fragile, like something sacred had settled between them, delicate and waiting to be understood. There were no words for what they had shared, for the strange and humbling experience he had glimpsed of Zira's past, of her connection with Rex. And yet, there was an unspoken agreement between them, a quiet acceptance that they had crossed a threshold together, each changed in ways they were only beginning to understand. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a soft, fading glow across the room, he took Zira's hand and guided her outside. The air was cool, filled with the scent of damp earth and faint whispers of autumn. Rex padded along beside them, his steps slow and deliberate, as if he, too, sensed the significance of this moment. They walked in silence, each step leading them deeper into the forest that stretched behind their home, its shadows growing long and mysterious as dusk settled in. Finally, they stopped in a small clearing, where the trees parted to reveal a sky filled with stars. He released her hand, stepping back and looking into her eyes, his own gaze filled with quiet resolve. I want us to create something together, he said, his voice soft but filled with a steady conviction, something that honors both of us and the connections that shape who we are. I think that's the only way I'll feel truly at peace. Zira looked at him, her expression unreadable for a moment, but then she nodded, a faint, hopeful smile breaking through her solemnity. What did you have in mind, she asked, her voice a soft echo in the night. He hesitated, gathering his thoughts, feeling the weight of his words. I don't know exactly, he admitted, his gaze drifting to the stars above. But I feel like there's a ritual, a way to bring all of this together, to acknowledge what you and Rex share, but also what we share, something that binds us here and now in this life. A flicker of understanding crossed her face, and she looked down at Rex, who met her gaze with a quiet, unwavering loyalty. There is a ritual in my world, she murmured, her eyes thoughtful, distant. It's called the bond of paths. It's a way of uniting souls who have come together across different lifetimes, honoring each connection as part of a greater whole. He listened, captivated by her words, feeling a strange warmth bloom in his chest. The idea of a ritual that could bind them, that could honor each of their bonds without diminishing any of them, felt like a balm to his soul, a resolution he hadn't dared hope for. Show me, he whispered, his voice filled with quiet reverence. Show me how to honor all of this, all of us. Zira knelt down, gesturing for him to do the same, and he joined her, feeling the earth cool beneath his hands. She placed one hand on Rex's head and the other in his, closing her eyes as she took a deep, steadying breath. He followed suit, letting his breath sync with hers, feeling the rhythm of her presence beside him, the solid, grounding warmth of her hand in his. Close your eyes, she murmured, her voice a gentle breeze in the quiet night. And imagine a thread connecting each of us, you, me, and Rex. See it as it weaves between us, forming a circle, binding us together. He did as she said, letting the image take shape in his mind. He saw a thread of light, soft and silvery, stretching from Zira to him, from him to Rex, and from Rex back to her, forming a glowing circle in the darkness. The thread pulsed with a quiet, steady warmth, and as he focused on it, he felt a sense of calm settle over him, as though he were being anchored to something deeper, something infinite. This bond we share, Zira continued, her voice filled with an almost ethereal calm. It is not bound by time or form. It is a connection that goes beyond one life, one relationship. It is a part of the universe itself, woven into the fabric of existence. He felt a shiver run through him, the depth of her words sinking into his soul, filling him with a sense of wonder and humility. He could feel the truth of it, the weight of the bond that connected them, not as a chain that bound them, but as a delicate, unbreakable thread that brought their lives together, a promise that would endure beyond the limitations of this life. As he held that image in his mind, he felt a surge of emotion, love, gratitude, acceptance flooding through him, washing away the remnants of jealousy and doubt. In that moment, he understood that he was part of something far greater than himself, that his love for Zira was only one facet of a bond that spanned lifetimes, that transcended the boundaries of understanding. Slowly, he opened his eyes and saw Zira gazing back at him, her expression filled with a tenderness he had never seen before. There was no longer any distance between them, no shadows of ancient bonds or unspoken fears. For the first time, he felt as though he truly saw her, not just as his partner, but as a soul who had walked through countless lives, each one shaping the person she was now. They sat together in silence, the stars shining above them, and he felt an overwhelming sense of peace. He looked down at Rex, who lay at their feet, his head resting on Zira's knee, his eyes filled with a quiet understanding. In that moment, he felt no jealousy, no fear. He felt only gratitude for this life, for this moment, for the love that bound them together. Zira reached for his hand, her fingers entwining with his, and they sat like that, bound in a circle of trust and understanding, a bond that no words could break. He knew that there would be challenges ahead, that the path they had chosen was not an easy one. But he also knew that they would face it together, united by a love that had been tested and proven, a love that would endure. As the night deepened, he felt a quiet joy settle over him, a joy that was as deep and ancient as the stars. And in that stillness, he made a silent promise to Zira, to Rex, to the bond they shared. He would honor this love, this connection, no matter what the future held. He would walk beside them, not as a replacement for the bonds of the past, but as a partner in this life, this moment, bound by a love that was all the stronger for having weathered the storm. The three of them sat together under the endless sky, their hands joined, their souls intertwined, a quiet promise woven into the fabric of the night. And as he looked up at the stars, he felt a sense of belonging, a quiet, profound peace, as though he had finally found his place in the universe, not as a rival or an outsider, but as an integral part of something far greater, something eternal. In that moment, he knew that whatever came next, they would face it together, bound by a love that transcended time, a love that would guide them through lifetimes, into the unknown, forever entwined.